So let's get started. Attached to this lecture, you find this starting project, which is this index.html file with a basic skeleton for our application. No view logic is in there yet, it's really just HTML. You got a style CSS file with some basic styles we're going to use throughout this module, so throughout this app. And you got an empty app.js file, because we're going to write all the view logic together step by step. Now, as I said in the last lecture, we're going to build a simple monster slayer game where we have a monster health and our health. We got various options for attacking, launching a special attack, healing ourselves, or surrendering, and we want to implement all of that with Vue so that we have this browser-based game here which we can fully control with JavaScript, but of course not with just JavaScript, but instead with Vue and JavaScript. And for that, obviously, we're going to start by controlling this with Vue. So by taking over control over some HTML code with Vue so that we can use Vue features here. And you might notice I already prepared this div with an ID game here, and well, that looks very tempting, and indeed this is the div we're going to control with Vue, because it turns out that inside of that div we got the entire game HTML code. The header is outside of the div, but the header is nothing we need to control with Vue. We're not going to use any Vue features in there. Therefore, in app.js, like we did many times before, we can create a Vue app by calling Vue create app, and we can store this in a constant and then mount our app here to this game div. So to this div with an ID game, and therefore we use the ID game selector here. So now we got a Vue app connected to this div, and now the question is, with which part do we want to start? There certainly is not just one possible route you could take. There are multiple routes, like always in programming, but I would suggest that we simply start with the attack button. So we basically implement features top to bottom. So the attack button here, when pressed, should of course reduce the monster's health, but at the same time the monster should then also strike back so that our health is also reduced. And we probably don't want to use a single hard-coded value by which we reduce healths, but we want to use some randomness so that our game isn't too predictable. And therefore, in app.js, I'm going to start by managing some data. And you already saw it by now in the last lectures and modules. Data, of course, is a core concept, a core thing in Vue apps, because pretty much any app you're going to build needs some data, no matter what you're managing in there, but you're going to need some data. Think of data as the variables you need in your regular JavaScript script codes, and it makes a lot of sense that we need data. For example, here in this game, which kind of data do we need to manage here to make anything really work? Well, how about the healths of the player and the monster? We need to manage that data, we need to manage that health data, because we're going to change it. And changes in the health, of course, should later be reflected back on the UI, so that these health bars are reduced. So therefore we need data. We need this data option in our Vue app configuration object. And as you learned in this data method, which it should be, we return the object that holds our actual data. And here I, as I just explained, have two main data points, and that would be the player health. And let's say we start at a value of 100 here, though of course you can pick any values you want. And we'll need a monster health. Now we could say the monster has more or less health, but I'm also going to set the monster health to 100. So now we get these two health values, which allow us to, well, manage the health of our two game participants. But the health alone is not enough. Of course, we also need ways of changing the health, for example, when an attack is launched. So that screams for methods, because methods are essentially the actions we support in our Vue application. For example, when the attack button is clicked, we want to trigger a method that reduces the monster health. And therefore, I'm going to name that method attack monster, because that's what we're doing. We're attacking the monster. Now, what should we do inside of this method then? What should happen inside of attack monster? Well, we want to calculate the damage we're dealing, and we then want to reduce the monster health by that damage. And as I said before, I want to use a random value here. You could, of course, always deduct the same amount from the monster health, but your game would be pretty predictable then. So to calculate a random value, we can use the mathRandom function, which gives us a random number between 0 and 1. Now, I don't want a value between 0 and 1. Instead, since we're working with a health of 100, we probably want a higher number. So for example, we could say that we want to get a random number between a minimum and a maximum value. Let's say between 5 and 12. We want to deal at least 5 points of damage, but no more than 12 points of damage. And the formula for calculating this is to multiply mathRandom with the difference of max, which is 12 as I just explained, minus the min value, which should be 5, for example. And then we take the floor of that to round it down so that we don't have a number with a decimal place, but we have an integer number instead. And we add the minimum again. This is a formula for calculating a random number between 5 and 12. So this will give me my attack value, let's say, by which I want to reduce the monster health. So therefore, here, I want to reach out to this monster health, and I explained that we can access all data properties in your methods through the this keyword, because Vue will merge all your data properties in this object into a global behind-the-scenes managed object, and that's why we can use this here in a method and get access to this monster health. And we want access to monster health so that we can set monster health equal to this monster health minus the attack value we just derived. We can also write this in a bit of a shorter way. We can use a JavaScript shortcut here, a shorthand notation, and use minus equal attack value. That's exactly doing the same thing. With that, we're reducing the monster health by the attack value we derived here. Now, that's one part of the equation. We want to be able to attack the monster. But of course, the monster should also be able to attack us as a player. And let's say, whenever we attacked the monster, as a consequence thereafter, the monster should attack back. So we can add a second method, a second action to our game, so to say, which is attack player. So that is the monster attacking us as a player. And here we want to do essentially the same. We want to get an attack value calculated randomly, but let's say the monster actually hits a bit harder, so the max damage is 15, and the min damage, let's say, is 8 instead of 5, so that by just spamming attack all the time, we probably won't win, because the monster hits us harder. And then we take this calculated attack value and deduct it from the player health. Like this. Now, since I have the same formula for calculating a random number, I will actually outsource this into a separate function. And here I'll use a regular JavaScript function and not a Vue method, because this will be a function which I only call from inside my JavaScript code, which will not use any Vue-controlled data properties or anything like that, and which will not be called from inside our template, so from inside our HTML code. And if all of that is the case, if you don't need access to view-controlled properties, if you're not calling the function from inside HTML, and you only use it from inside the JavaScript code, then you can write a regular JavaScript function, and I'll name it getRandomValue, and I want to get a min and a max boundary here, and then just grab that formula, cut it, and return it here. And replace 12 with max and 5 with min. And the advantage of this is that we can now simply call getRandomValue here and pass in 5 and 12, and do the same down there and pass in 8 and 15. And with that we save some code and we simply outsource this into a separate function. Okay. So with that, we got our two actions. One thing is missing here in those methods, and then of course we also need to connect this to the HTML code. But the missing thing here, of course, is that attack player should be triggered whenever we attacked the monster. So here after attack monster, I'll reach out to attack player and call this method here. And that's something we haven't done thus far in the previous modules. But just as we can access data properties through the this keyword, we can also access methods through the this keyword inside of the view instance config object here. And the reason for that is the same as with the data properties. I mentioned that this data would be merged into a behind the scenes managed global object, and it's the same for methods and for computed properties. All of that is getting merged into that behind-the-scenes controlled global object. And therefore, just as we can access data properties through the this keyword inside of methods, we can also access other methods in there and call them. So we can call attack player here from inside attack monster to make sure that this method executes right after this method executed. And with that, we're done with the JavaScript code for now. But of course, we also need to connect this to our HTML content now. We need to make sure that in our HTML code, we now also trigger attack monster when the attack button is clicked, and that we update those health bars. So let's work on that next. Of course, feel free to try this on your own first, before we then continue together in the next lecture.